Hi, my name is Layla, and for this project we will be talking about historical events that happened through the 60s and 70s, the Vietnam War, and the Civil Rights Movement.
I'm Nelda Gandy. I'm 80 years old. I grew up in Greenville in Northeast Texas.
And I am James Gandy. I grew up in Harlingen in Cameron County in Deep South Texas. I've lived in Lubbock since 1964, and I'm 87 years old.
What was life like during the Vietnam War and Civil Rights Movement?
We watched the nightly news for the death count that day of all members of the military that were killed in the line of duty. People faithfully watched every night, anxiously awaiting the news. The nation was divided in support of the war. On one hand, it was thought to be needed to combat communism, and the other side did not believe we should sacrifice our young people fighting for a foreign country.
And it was a time of turmoil. You watched television every night also to see how many people were arrested for demonstrating about the Vietnam War. There was also demonstrations about civil rights movement like in Alabama and Mississippi, and it was a time of much turmoil.
Many young men fled to Canada to avoid being drafted into the military. It was a period of great civil unrest. There was also civil unrest concerning segregation. Nightly news reported riots of students at colleges, for example, Kent State in Ohio, and the National Guard was called in to disperse the students who were protesting the draft. They were not supposed to have live ammunition, but 4 students were shot dead. The whole nation was in complete shock, and riots then became fewer.
How did the Vietnam War affect your family?
I'm not sure how they affected my family.
No one in our family was called to serve in the military. James was teaching, so he was deferred for military duty.
How did people adapt to cultural changes?
The entire era of the Vietnam War was a season of change, unrest, uncertainty. People became selfish, self-absorbing, and unruly, many times challenging authority of any kind. It was also very unsettling that the supposedly intellectuals repeatedly said, "God is dead." And personally, for our family, we were a family of faith, devoted to each other and our spirituality. We believed in law and order and civility toward everybody. But I didn't grow up in that environment. My school was segregated. Black children in our area were bused 50 miles one way to a school for black children only. The Civil Rights Movement protests showed successful movement. So, when the Vietnam War started, young people decided to protest against being drafted to fight in the war.
Before I got into high school, there were not very many blacks that lived in Harlingen, but it had been segregated, and there was only one elementary school that they could go to, the black kids. And if they wanted to go to high school, they had to get on the bus every morning and travel 45 miles north to McAllen, which was the only black high school in the whole Rio Grande Valley.
What were the lifestyles like?
Well, eventually the men began to wear a lot longer hair. They'd always had crew cuts and flat tops and things like that. And along about that time, they began to grow it longer and grow beards and wear sloppy clothes and challenge any kind of authority. They could do whatever they wanted to do, and nobody was supposed to tell them that they could not do these things.
Women had, quote, big hair, teased and stiff from hairspray. Men grew their hair longer instead of a close-cropped, neat style. They wore bright colors, leisure suits, white shoes, mini skirts, and go-go boots, and large framed eyeglasses. Fashion became more relaxed. When I was in high school, I wore pantyhose, gloves, and a hat to church, always. During this time, clothing became more casual and flamboyant.
When I graduated in 1956 from high school, the hairstyles for men began to change a whole lot. They began to have ducktails, and they had a bogey hair, what they call a bogey haircut, which was a flat top on top and then ducktails on the side and the back, and a lot of greasy hair.
What are y'all's overall thoughts on the Vietnam War and Civil Rights Movement?
Well, a lot of these young men, when they were drafted to go off to war, they were not able to fight the war to win it because of all of the politics that was going on in the United States at that time. And it was really tough on them, really hard on them, because when they'd come back and come off the plane, there would be people there demonstrating against them, throwing things at them, cussing at them. They spit on them, called them baby killers, and every bad thing imaginable they were called. And of course that had to affect these young men. They'd been out there fighting, they thought, for their country, and then they come back and, have to put up with all that. There was a chemical called Agent Orange that was used to defoliate, that was sprayed on the jungle there to defoliate it so that they could see the Viet Congolese a lot easier. And that caused a lot of health problems with these young men when they came home from fighting in Vietnam. And they were accused of a lot of things that they didn't do. I remember one time the news media had this photo of a little girl, a little Vietnamese girl, running, and she had been on fire from all of this fighting that was going on, and they claimed it was because of the United States. And when they figured it all out, it was the Vietnam who had caused this. And, of course, she died from it, poor little girl. But there were things like that all the time that the news media made up, and they didn't tell you the truth. And Walter Cronkite was one of them who did not tell you the truth. He was one of the most famous announcers on TV, in the 6 o'clock news. And as far as I was concerned, he did not always tell you the truth.
What is one core memory you have during that time?
The moon landing was a great exploit that elevated the mood of the people to get off thoughts of the war. It was exciting to think about the ingenuity of Americans. Some people, though, were very skeptical and believed the moon landing was a hoax. It was the topic of discussion for most people and gave them something to keep their minds from the civil unrest going on at the same time. Also, President Kennedy
was assassinated. And also during this time period in 1963 was the Cuban Missile Crisis with the Soviet Union. They were bringing in missiles and putting them in Cuba, and Kennedy said, "You're not going to do that." And so there was real fear there of everybody in the U.S. of us getting into a nuclear war. And it was very scary. But eventually the Soviet Union backed down and took all those out of there.
Also, Martin Luther King was assassinated during that time. So those were very difficult times to live through. Also, Elvis Presley was famous during this time for the rock and roll king. He was the music of teenagers, and there was a lot of unrest between teenagers and older adults about the type of music that was becoming popular. Older people thought Elvis's music was vulgar, and also at that time, protest music became very prevalent. Songs protesting government authority, any kind of authority, became very popular.
In your own opinion, if these events that occur didn't happen, would you think the world would have been the same as it was back then, or be what it is today?
Well, it's hard to answer that, but I believe, in my opinion, that later on everything would have changed, just like what happened with the Civil Rights Movement, because the U.S. was already moving in that direction. It would have been slower, and I can't tell you about the Vietnam War. It was a really, really bad thing for everybody that was involved in it. For the young men who had to go off to war, their families, for the people in the U.S., because some people were nasty about it and some people were in favor of it, and it was bad news all the way around.
This is the end of this podcast. Thank you for answering these questions and sharing your stories.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to reflect on those past years, so thank you, Layla.
Thank you, Layla.